What does it take to erase your own past? To burn the bridges, slaughter the sacred cows, and march into the furnace of the unknown with nothing but a sword in your hand and a curse on your lips? For the people who would one day be called Vandals, this was not a philosophical question, it was the very act of birth. Their story does not begin in the gilded halls of a palace, but in the cold, damp mists of the north, somewhere in the murky forests that would one day become Poland or Scandinavia. They were not yet a weapon, but the raw iron ore, waiting for the forge. They were one of many Germanic tribes, a chaotic symphony of hunger, ambition, and desperation, pushing against the unyielding borders of the Roman world. Rome, to them, was not a beacon of civilization. It was a promise, a vast, glittering treasury groaning under the weight of its own gold, ripe for the taking. They watched the Goths, their bitter rivals, hammer at the gates of the empire, sometimes as allies of Rome, sometimes as its enemies. They learned. They saw that loyalty was a currency spent by the weak, and that steel was the only argument a true king ever needed. The early years were a brutal education in the unforgiving school of migration. Every league forward was paid for in blood. They fought Goths, Franks, Alemanni. They learned that the world was a wheel of violence, and you were either the one turning it or the one being crushed beneath it. What would you do faced with such a choice? Would you cling to the fading warmth of your ancestral lands, waiting for the next famine or the next warlord to wipe you from existence? Or would you join the great, terrifying river of peoples flowing south, a human avalanche seeking to bury the old world? The Vandals chose the river. They became the current. They were a people honing their rage into a fine point, learning that a shield wall was more reliable than a treaty, and that the only true border was the one you could defend with your own life. Their identity was forged in the crucible of constant warfare. They were not farmers or builders. They became specialists in the art of destruction, masters of the lightning raid. They were the predators lurking in the shadows of a dying empire. Their first real taste of Roman blood was intoxicating. Skirmishes along the Danube frontier, the glint of a legionary's helmet, the satisfying heft of a captured gladius. They were hired as mercenaries, federati, the barbarian watchdogs meant to guard the Roman chicken coop, a fatal mistake on Rome's part. You do not hire wolves to guard sheep and expect the flock to remain intact. They saw the empire from the inside. They saw its weaknesses, its political rot, its endless civil wars. They saw generals who cared more for the throne in Ravenna than for the frontiers of Gaul. Rome thought it was civilizing them, teaching them its ways. In reality, the Vandals were merely taking notes, conducting reconnaissance for a war they knew was inevitable. They were learning the layout of the treasury before they kicked down the door. An empire builds walls not to keep barbarians out, but to keep its own illusions in. The illusion of permanence, of eternal order, was about to be shattered, the pressure built. To the east, a new terror was rising from the steppes, the Huns, a name whispered in fear, a tide of nomadic fury that displaced everyone in its path. The Goths were pushed westward, and they, in turn, pushed the Vandals. It was a domino effect of terror, a chain reaction of displacement that sent shockwaves across the continent. There was no longer any room in the old world. The forests were crowded, the river valleys were battlegrounds. The Vandals, united with the nomadic Alans and the hardy Suebi, found themselves cornered, their backs to the wall. Ahead of them lay the Roman province of Gaul, prosperous and poorly defended. Behind them, the endless tide of their enemies. There was no choice. To stand still was to die. To retreat was to die. The only path was forward, through the heart of the empire. What makes people burn their bridges behind them and plunge into the abyss of the unknown? Is it courage, or is it the simple, brutal fact that the fire behind them is hotter than any flame they might face ahead? For the Vandals, the Alans, and the Suebi, huddled on the eastern bank of the Rhine, in the winter of 406, it was the latter. The air was so cold it felt like glass, and the once mighty river, the very symbol of Roman power and the demarcation between order and chaos, was frozen solid. a highway of ice laid down by nature herself, pointed directly into the heart of the empire. It was an invitation from the gods of winter, an omen. It was a chance to trade a slow death in the frozen forests for a quick, glorious one in the pillaged villas of Gaul, or better yet, a life of unimaginable wealth. They were about to place the greatest bet in their history, and the stakes were nothing less than their own survival. The world was about to learn that the end of an era does not arrive with a polite knock. It comes with the shattering of a frozen river and the howl of a hungry people. This was their Rubicon, a moment of absolute, terrifying clarity. The crossing of the Rhine was not a military invasion in the Roman sense, planned in war rooms and supplied by logistical trains. It was an exodus, an entire nation, tens of thousands of warriors, their wives, their children, their elderly, their wagons piled high with everything they owned, stepped onto the ice on the night of December 31st, 406. It was a ghost army moving under a winter moon, a nation walking on water. Could you trade peace for a chance to be king of the world, even for just one day? The Roman garrisons, depleted and demoralized, huddled by their fires, never imagining that the river itself would betray them. The border, which had held for 4 centuries, ceased to exist in a single night. The scream of Roman Gaul began at dawn. The invasion was not a battle, it was a storm. It was a force of nature that swept across the land, and the Roman defenses were like sandcastles against a tsunami. The city of Mogontiacum, modern-day Mainz, was the first to fall. It was sacked with a methodical fury. Then came Treverorum, a provincial capital, a jewel of Roman Gaul. It was burned. The stories that trickled out were tales of horror. Villas set ablaze, their mosaic floors cracked by the heat. Libraries turned to ash. The carefully ordered world of the Gallo-Roman aristocracy, with its vineyards, bathhouses, and literary salons, was ripped apart. For Rome, history was a carefully constructed monument. For the Vandals, it was a bonfire. They were not trying to conquer land in the traditional sense, they were consuming it. They were a swarm of locusts in human form, driven by a century of hunger. They were plundering the plundered, taking back from the empire a fraction of the wealth Rome had extracted from a dozen conquered provinces for centuries. The Roman response was pathetic, paralyzed. The Western Roman Empire was a hollowed-out giant, rotting from the inside. Its best legions were in Italy, guarding against political coups, or in Britannia, dealing with their own usurpers. The armies in Gaul were a shadow of their former glory, a patchwork of unreliable mercenaries and local militias. The Vandal-Alan-Suebi Confederation cut a bloody swathe through the province for 3 long years. They were unstoppable. They moved faster than the Roman command structure could react. They lived off the land, which meant they stripped it bare. This was not the warfare of set-piece battles and honorable surrenders that Roman generals understood. This was total war. This was the future, a future of fire and chaos, and Rome was utterly unprepared for it. The Vandal was no longer a barbarian at the gate. He was in the house, helping himself to the silver. After 3 years of relentless devastation, Gaul was a picked clean carcass. There was little left to plunder. The confederation of tribes, their bellies full but their future uncertain, looked south. Beyond the snow-capped peaks of the Pyrenees lay another Roman province, one that had been largely untouched by the chaos: Hispania. It was a new pantry, vast and rich, famed for its silver mines, its olive groves, and its fine horses. For the Vandals, it was the next logical step in their bloody pilgrimage. They left the smouldering ruins of Gaul behind them without a second thought. They were not sentimentalists. The past was a burden, and the future was whatever they could take with their own hands. They had crossed the Rhine and broken the spine of Roman Gaul. Now they would cross the Pyrenees and teach Hispania the meaning of their name. Their journey was transforming them. They were no longer just refugees fleeing the Huns. They were becoming a nation of warriors, a kingdom on the march. Hispania was not an empty prize waiting to be claimed. It was a trap, a cauldron where the ambitions of multiple barbarian tribes and the remnants of Roman power would boil over into a war of all against all. The peninsula became an arena, a gladiatorial contest where Vandals, Alans, Suebi, and the soon-to-arrive Visigoths, sent by Rome to restore order, would slaughter each other for the right to rule. There were no grand principles at stake here. This was a naked, brutal struggle for survival. Here, in the sun-drenched landscapes and rugged mountains of Hispania, the Vandals would complete their transformation. They would learn not only how to fight, but how to rule, how to betray, and how to build a kingdom from blood and ashes. The scorched earth of Hispania would become the unlikely cradle of the Vandal kingdom, a state born in perpetual conflict, its only law, the law of the sword. What was the driving force behind the Vandals' relentless march? Was it the primal fear of being annihilated or a burning ambition to carve out a new world for themselves? Let us know in the comments which motive you think was stronger by writing fear or ambition. Hispania became a bloody chessboard. The tribes divided the peninsula among themselves by drawing lots, a deceptively civilized way of carving up a stolen land. The Siling Vandals took the rich southern province of Baetica. The Hasdingi Vandals, along with the Suebi, settled in the northwest, in Galicia. The Alans, their nomadic allies, took the central provinces. For a brief moment, an uneasy peace settled over the land. But peace was a language these peoples had long forgotten. The new reality was a chaotic free-for-all. Roman authority had effectively collapsed, existing only in a few fortified cities along the coast. It was a world of warlords where alliances were forged in the morning and broken by noon, sealed with wine and shattered with an axe. The Vandals, under their ruthless king Gunderic, proved to be the most adept players in this deadly game. Gunderic was not a strategist in the Roman mold, he was a predator. He understood that in this new world, terror was a more effective tool than diplomacy. The wars were incessant and merciless. The Vandals fought the Suebi in the mountains of the north. They turned on their former allies, the Alans, and in a single decisive battle, they crushed them so completely that the surviving Alan nobles offered their crown to Gunderic. From that day forward, the Vandal kings would style themselves Rex Vandalorum et Alanorum, king of the Vandals and the Alans. They were not just absorbing peoples, they were absorbing their identities, their warrior traditions. They were becoming stronger, more cohesive. The Visigoths, acting as Rome's hired muscle, entered the fray, driving the Siling Vandals out of Baetica. But this was like trying to put out a forest fire with a bucket of water. For every enemy the Vandals defeated, two more seemed to rise. This constant grinding warfare was their element. It kept them sharp. It weeded out the weak. While other tribes might have been worn down, the Vandals thrived. They learned to fight guerrilla campaigns in the mountains, to conduct lightning raids on enemy supply lines, and to besiege walled cities. In the year 422, they inflicted a humiliating defeat on a Roman army sent to subdue them. The Roman general Castinus had brought with him a large contingent of Visigothic allies. But at the critical moment of the battle, the Visigoths betrayed him and switched sides. The Roman legions were annihilated. It was a signal victory. The Vandals had not just defeated a Roman patrol, they had crushed a full-fledged imperial army. They captured the port city of Carthago Nova and began to learn the arts of seafaring. They were no longer just a land-based horde. They were looking to the sea, and the sea was looking back, whispering promises of new lands to conquer, of riches beyond their wildest dreams. Hispania had been a brutal but necessary education. It had taught them that survival was not enough. The goal was dominance. It was here that they cemented their philosophy: plunder the plundered, take from those who have taken from others. It was a simple, brutal creed, perfectly suited to a simple, brutal age. But Hispania was also becoming a cage. The land was exhausted by decades of warfare. The Visigoths were a constant threat from the north. The Vandals knew they could not stay here forever. They needed a secure base, a kingdom of their own, rich enough to sustain them, defensible enough to hold against all comers. And then Gundrick died. He was succeeded by his half-brother, a man who would become a legend. His name was Gaiseric. He was described by Roman historians as a man of medium height, lame in one leg from a fall from a horse. He was a man of few words but of deep and cunning thought. He was utterly without mercy, a master of deception, and arguably the most brilliant barbarian strategist of his age. Gaiseric looked at the Vandal position in Hispania and saw not a kingdom, but a dead end. His gaze went past the shores of Hispania, across the narrow strait of water that separated Europe from Africa. He looked at the Roman province of Africa, the breadbasket of the empire, the source of Rome's wealth and stability, and he began to dream an impossible dream. Africa was the jewel in the crown of the Western Roman Empire. It was a land of vast latifundia, enormous estates that produced the grain that fed the city of Rome. Its great cities, Carthage, Hippo Regius, Cirta, were centers of Roman culture and commerce, largely untouched by the wars that had ravaged the rest of the empire. To the Romans, the idea of a barbarian invasion of Africa was unthinkable. It was protected by the sea, and the Romans were masters of the sea, or so they thought. But Gaiseric was not a conventional thinker. A wise king doesn't conquer a fortress. He waits for the traitor to open the gate. And a traitor was about to appear. The governor of Africa, a Roman general named Bonifacius, found himself on the losing end of a political power struggle with his rival, Aetius, the supreme commander of the Roman armies. Fearing for his life, Bonifacius made a catastrophic decision. He sent a message to Gaiseric in Hispania, inviting him to bring his people to Africa to help him fight Aetius. It was the gravest miscalculation in Roman history. Gaiseric seized the opportunity with both hands. This was the chance he had been waiting for. He began to gather ships, commandeering, buying, and stealing every vessel he could find along the Spanish coast. He then conducted a census of his people. He counted every man, woman, and child, every warrior, and every slave. The total came to 80,000 souls. This was not going to be a raid. He was moving his entire nation, burning his bridges behind him one last time. In the spring of 429, the Vandal fleet set sail from the port of Iulia Traducta, modern-day Tarifa. They were leaving the bloody quagmire of Hispania behind forever. They were a nation on the water, a kingdom afloat, heading for the promised land. The crossing of the Strait of Gibraltar was one of the most audacious and consequential acts of the entire migration period. It was a gamble of epic proportions. If the Roman fleet intercepted them, they would be annihilated. But Gaiseric had timed his move perfectly. The Roman navy was weak and disorganized. The empire was distracted by its internal squabbles. The Vandals landed on the shores of Africa unopposed. The invasion of Africa was a blitzkrieg. The local Roman forces were weak and scattered, and the Romanized population, many of whom were oppressed by heavy taxes and the persecution of religious minorities like the Donatists, offered little resistance. Some even welcomed the Vandals as liberators. Bonifacius, the Roman governor who had invited them, quickly realized his mistake and tried to get them to leave. Gaiseric laughed in his face. The Vandals were not guests, they were the new masters. They swept eastward along the coast, a tide of unstoppable violence. They laid siege to the city of Hippo Regius, where the famous theologian Saint Augustine died during the siege, lamenting the collapse of the world he had known. The Vandals were not interested in assimilating into the Roman world. They were here to take it over. They were seizing the engine room of the empire. By capturing Africa, Gaiseric was not just gaining a kingdom, he was putting a knife to the throat of Rome itself. The grain supply was cut. Panic began to spread in the Eternal City. The Romans were forced to come to terms. In 435, they signed a treaty with Gaiseric, officially granting the Vandals lands in Africa. But for Gaiseric, a treaty was just a pause, a moment to catch his breath before the next strike. He used the time to consolidate his power and study his ultimate prize, the city of Carthage. Carthage was the second largest city in the Western Empire, a magnificent port, and the capital of Roman Africa. It was heavily fortified and believed to be impregnable. Gaiseric knew that as long as Carthage remained in Roman hands, his kingdom would never be secure. He needed the city, its wealth, its shipyards, and its strategic location. He waited for the perfect moment. On October 19, 439, while the city's inhabitants were distracted by the chariot races at the Hippodrome, Gaiseric launched a surprise attack. His forces stormed the city from the sea, and Carthage fell almost without a fight. The capture of Carthage was a thunderclap that echoed across the Mediterranean. It was a strategic masterstroke that fundamentally altered the balance of power. The Vandals were no longer a barbarian horde. They were a sovereign power with a capital city, a treasury, and most importantly, a navy. In the harbour of Carthage, Gaiseric found the bulk of the Western Roman fleet. He seized it. In a single day, the landlocked nomads who had crossed the frozen Rhine just a generation earlier became the masters of the Mediterranean Sea. The transformation was complete. They had found their home, their kingdom. But a predator does not simply settle down and grow fat. The capture of Carthage was not an end. It was the beginning of a new chapter in their story. A chapter of piracy, plunder, and terror that would make the Vandal name feared from the shores of Greece to the Pillars of Hercules. They now had a base from which to truly implement their philosophy. Plunder the plundered. And the biggest plunderer of them all, Rome, was now just a short sea journey away. Gaiseric's decision to move his entire nation to Africa was a monumental risk. What do you think is a greater motivator for such world-changing decisions? A brilliant strategic vision or sheer desperate opportunism? Tell us what you think in the comments with the word strategic or opportunism. With the shipyards of Carthage under their control, the Vandals unleashed a reign of terror upon the Mediterranean. This was not the random piracy of scattered sea raiders. This was state-sponsored piracy on an industrial scale. Gaiseric's fleets were organized, disciplined, and relentless. They became the wolfpack of the sea, and the Roman merchant ships were their flock. They systematically targeted the great islands of the Western Mediterranean, the vital nodes of Roman trade and supply. Sicily, the empire's other great granary, was raided annually. Sardinia, with its rich mines, and Corsica, with its timber, were conquered and absorbed into the growing Vandal maritime empire. The Balearic Islands fell soon after. The Vandal kingdom was no longer just an African kingdom. It was an empire of the sea, its power projected by the long, sleek warships that slipped out of the harbour of Carthage. Rome thought it was building eternity from stone, but the Vandals proved that true power isn't walls, but the ships that can sail around them. Life under Vandal rule in Africa was a brutal affair for the old Roman aristocracy. Gaiseric systematically broke their power. He confiscated the great estates, the latifundia, and distributed them among his Vandal warriors. The wealthy Roman senators and landowners were dispossessed, exiled, or killed. The Catholic clergy suffered a similar fate. The Vandals were adherents of Arian Christianity, a branch of the faith considered heretical by the Nicene, or Catholic, Church in Rome and Constantinople. This religious divide was not merely a theological quibble, it was a tool of political control. Gaiseric and his successors used the persecution of the Catholic Church to crush any potential focus of opposition to their rule. Churches were closed, bishops were exiled, and property was seized. The Vandals were establishing a new order, one in which they were the unquestioned masters, and the numerous Roman African population were second-class subjects. They were not interested in creating a hybrid culture. They were an occupying force, a warrior elite ruling over a conquered people. The Roman world was in a state of shock. The loss of Africa was a mortal blow to the Western Empire. It was an economic catastrophe and a deep psychological trauma. The Eternal Empire was bleeding out and the Vandals were twisting the knife. The Eastern Roman Empire in Constantinople tried to intervene, sending a large fleet to retake Carthage, but the expedition was a dismal failure, defeated by a combination of Vandal naval skill and Roman incompetence. For decades, the Mediterranean became a Vandal lake. Their fleets raided the coasts of Italy, Dalmatia, and even Greece. They controlled the vital shipping lanes, and no vessel was safe without their permission. They were strangling the life out of the old Roman world, growing rich on the plunder. Gaiseric, the lame king from the forests of the north, was now one of the most powerful men in the world. He had built a kingdom on the ruins of Roman Africa and turned his people into the undisputed lords of the sea. But all of this was merely a prelude. The raids, the piracy, the conquest of the islands, it was all building towards one ultimate act of defiance, one grand, symbolic gesture of Vandal power. Gaiseric watched the political situation in Italy with a predator's patience. In 455, the moment he had been waiting for arrived. The Western Roman Emperor, Valentinian III, was assassinated. In the ensuing chaos, a senator named Petronius Maximus seized the throne and, to legitimize his rule, forced Valentinian's widow, Licinia Eudoxia, to marry him. According to one popular account, the outraged empress sent a secret message to Gaiseric in Carthage, begging him to come and free her from the usurper. Whether the story is true or not, Gaiseric needed no invitation. The political vacuum in Italy was an open door, and he intended to walk through it. He assembled a massive fleet. Its destination was not some provincial town or remote island. Its destination was the mouth of the Tiber. Its destination was Rome itself. The news of the Vandal fleet's approach sent a wave of sheer terror through the Eternal City. The Roman state was in chaos. The usurper emperor, Petronius Maximus, proved to be utterly useless. As the Vandals disembarked at the port of Ostia, he attempted to flee the city, but he was recognized by an angry mob, stoned to death, and his body was torn to pieces and thrown into the Tiber. Rome was leaderless, defenseless, and paralyzed with fear. The city's inhabitants braced themselves for the kind of slaughter and destruction that had befallen so many other cities. But Gaiseric was not a mindless destroyer. He was a businessman. As his army stood before the gates of Rome, he was met by a strange procession. It was led by Pope Leo I, the same man who had famously persuaded Attila the Hun not to sack the city a few years earlier. Leo came to plead for Rome. He begged Gaiseric to spare the city from fire and its people from slaughter. In return, he promised that the Vandals could take the city's wealth. Gaiseric agreed to the terms. This was not to be a chaotic rampage. It was to be a systematic, organized, and thorough stripping of assets. For 14 days, from June 2nd to June 16th, 455, the Vandals plundered Rome. The city gates were thrown open, and Gaiseric's men went to work with cold, efficient professionalism. They emptied the imperial palace of its treasures. They stripped the temples of their gold and silver ornaments. They famously removed the gilded bronze tiles from the roof of the Temple of Jupiter, Optimus Maximus, on the Capitoline Hill. They took everything of value that was portable. They even took the sacred treasures from the temple in Jerusalem, which the Emperor Titus had brought to Rome as spoils of war centuries before. It was the ultimate act of plundering the plundered. The Vandals were not just taking Roman gold, they were taking treasures the Romans had themselves looted from a dozen conquered nations. When the 2 weeks were over, the Vandals departed as methodically as they had arrived. They loaded their ships with unimaginable quantities of gold, silver, bronze, furniture, statues, and precious artworks. But they took more than just inanimate objects. As part of their haul, they carried off the Empress Licinia Eudoxia and her 2 daughters, Eudocia and Placidia. The capture of the imperial family was the ultimate humiliation for the Roman world. Gaiseric's daughter-in-law was now an empress. The Vandal king had not just sacked Rome, he had taken its legacy, its treasures, and its women. He returned to Carthage in triumph. The sack of Rome in 455 cemented the Vandals' reputation in history. It was from this event that the modern word vandalism, meaning senseless destruction, would eventually be derived. But for Gaiseric, it was not senseless. It was a calculated act of power politics, the culmination of his life's work. He had brought the greatest empire the world had ever known to its knees. His kingdom was secure, his treasury was overflowing, and his name was a synonym for terror. The Vandal kingdom of Africa was now at the zenith of its power, a predatory state that held the entire Mediterranean in a chokehold. But its very foundation was built on a deep and irreconcilable conflict. The ruling Vandal elite were Arian Christians, while the vast majority of their subjects, the Roman Africans, were Nicene Catholics. This was a festering wound that refused to heal. Gaiseric and his successors, particularly his son Honoric, engaged in brutal persecutions of the Catholic clergy. Bishops were exiled, church property was confiscated, and believers were subjected to horrific tortures. This was not just religious fanaticism, it was a desperate attempt to maintain control. The Catholic Church, with its loyalty to Rome and Constantinople, was seen as a fifth column, a potential source of rebellion. By trying to crush it, the Vandal kings only succeeded in alienating their subjects and earning the undying enmity of the rest of the Christian world, especially the powerful Eastern Roman Empire in Constantinople. The Eastern Empire had not forgotten the humiliation of Africa's loss. They viewed the Vandals as pirates and heretics, an intolerable cancer on the Roman sea. Several attempts were made to dislodge them, but Gaiseric's strategic genius and naval prowess proved superior every time. The most spectacular failure came in 468. The Eastern Emperor, Leo I, assembled one of the largest amphibious invasion forces in ancient history. More than 1,000 ships carrying over 100,000 soldiers and sailors set sail for Carthage. The command was given to the emperor's brother-in-law, Basiliscus, a man whose incompetence was matched only by his arrogance. The massive fleet anchored at Cape Bon, a short distance from Carthage, and the Romans felt confident of victory. Gaiseric, facing overwhelming odds, resorted to cunning. He asked for a 5-day truce to negotiate a surrender. Basiliscus foolishly agreed. Gaiseric used those 5 days to prepare his masterstroke. On the 5th night, under the cover of darkness, a fleet of Vandal ships sailed silently towards the anchored Roman armada. But these were no ordinary warships. They were fireships, old galleys packed with combustible materials transformed into floating bombs. A favorable wind sprang up, blowing directly towards the Roman fleet. The Vandals set their fireships ablaze and sent them sailing into the heart of the densely packed imperial navy. The effect was apocalyptic. The Roman ships, caught completely by surprise, were easy targets. The flames leaped from vessel to vessel. The night was lit up by a sea of fire. Panic seized the Roman crews. Men jumped into the water to escape the flames, only to be cut down by Vandal marines who followed in the wake of the fireships. An emperor can build 1,000 ships, but he cannot command the wind nor the fire that rides upon it. The Battle of Cape Bon was an unmitigated disaster for the Roman Empire. More than half of their fleet was destroyed, and tens of thousands of men were lost. Basiliscus fled back to Constantinople in disgrace. The imperial treasury was bankrupted by the cost of the expedition. It was a stunning victory for Gaiseric, perhaps his greatest. He had defeated the combined might of the Eastern and Western empires and secured his kingdom for another generation. He would die peacefully in his bed in 477, nearly 50 years after leading his people into Africa. He had started as the king of a wandering tribe and ended as the master of the Mediterranean, an empire slayer who had brought Rome to its knees. But the seeds of his kingdom's destruction were already sown. The wealth he had won would become a poison, and the religious divisions he had exploited would become a fatal weakness. The fire that had burned so brightly was destined to consume itself. When a kingdom is built on conquest, can it ever find peace without collapsing? Is it the eternal struggle for power that holds a warrior society together, or a shared set of sacred beliefs? Share your thoughts below with the word power or belief. After the long and fearsome reign of Gaiseric, a slow poison began to seep into the heart of the Vandal kingdom. The poison was luxury. The warrior elite, who had once slept on the frozen ground and lived on scavenged food, were now masters of opulent villas overlooking the Mediterranean. Their grandfathers had worn rough-spun wool and animal hides. They now dressed in fine silks imported from the East. They attended the chariot races in the great hippodrome of Carthage and relaxed in the Roman-style baths attended by armies of slaves. The sons of wolves raised in a palace forget how to hunt and only learn how to feast. The fierce, ascetic discipline that had carried the Vandals across Europe was dissolving in the warm African sun. Their wealth had become their curse, softening their bodies and dulling their warrior spirit. The sword arm grew weak, accustomed to holding a wine cup instead of a spear. The court of the Vandal kings became a snake pit of intrigue and betrayal, mirroring the worst decadence of the Roman Empire they had overthrown. Geiseric's successors were, for the most part, a pale imitation of their formidable ancestor. His son Huneric was a cruel tyrant whose reign was marked by vicious persecutions of Catholics. His successors, Thrasimund and Hilderic, were more concerned with Roman culture and courtly pleasures than with maintaining military readiness. Palace coups became commonplace. Kings were overthrown and murdered by their own relatives. Hilderic, who was pro-Roman and had ceased the persecution of Catholics, was toppled by his cousin Gelimer, a man who sought to restore the old, aggressive Vandal traditions. This internal strife weakened the kingdom from within, making it vulnerable. A house divided against itself cannot stand, especially when that house is surrounded by enemies. While the Vandal elite were feasting and plotting in Carthage, the foundations of their kingdom were cracking. The native Berber tribes of the interior, known to the Romans as the Moors, had never been fully subdued. Under Geiseric's strong hand, they had been kept in check. But under his weaker successors, they rose in open rebellion. They began to chip away at the edges of the Vandal kingdom, raiding its frontiers and even establishing their own independent kingdoms in the mountains. The Vandal army, once the terror of the Roman world, proved increasingly ineffective against these tough guerrilla fighters. They lost control of large parts of the interior. The Vandal kingdom was shrinking, its authority increasingly confined to the coastal cities. They had become landlords who could no longer control their own property. They had forgotten the most important rule of power: what is taken by the sword must be held by the sword. This internal decay did not go unnoticed. In Constantinople, a new emperor had ascended the throne of the Eastern Roman Empire. His name was Justinian, and he was a man of boundless ambition and energy. Justinian dreamed of restoring the Roman Empire to its former glory, of reconquering the lost Western provinces and reuniting the Mediterranean world under a single Orthodox Christian emperor. He saw the Vandal kingdom in Africa as a heretical, illegitimate state, a pirate nest that had to be exterminated. The internal chaos within the Vandal kingdom, culminating in Gelimer's overthrow of the pro-Roman Hilderic, gave Justinian the perfect pretext to intervene. He could claim he was not waging a war of conquest, but merely restoring the legitimate king to his throne. It was a flimsy excuse, but it was all he needed. Justinian had at his disposal one of the greatest military minds of the age, the general Belisarius. Belisarius was everything the Vandal commanders were not: disciplined, cunning, a master of logistics and combined arms tactics. While the Vandals had grown soft, the Eastern Roman army had been hardened by constant warfare against the Persians on the eastern frontier. Justinian ordered Belisarius to prepare an invasion force. It was a risky gamble. The memory of the disastrous expedition of 468 was still fresh in Constantinople. Many of his advisors urged him against it, but Justinian was not a man to be deterred. The time for revenge had come. In the summer of 533, a fleet of 500 ships carrying 15,000 of the empire's best soldiers set sail from Constantinople. The empire was about to strike back. The gilded cage the Vandals had built for themselves in Africa was about to be shattered. The expedition of Belisarius was a model of military efficiency, a stark contrast to the Vandal crossing a century earlier. The Byzantine fleet made its way carefully across the Mediterranean, landing unopposed on the coast of modern-day Tunisia. The Vandal king, Gelimer, was caught completely off guard. He made a series of catastrophic tactical errors. He had sent the bulk of the Vandal fleet and a significant portion of his army to Sardinia to put down a rebellion, leaving Carthage dangerously exposed. When news of Belisarius's landing reached him, he panicked. He ordered his brother Amatus to hold the strategic pass of Ad Decimum, 10 miles south of Carthage, while he approached with the main army from the south, hoping to catch the Romans in a pincer movement. It was a sound plan on paper, but its execution was a disaster. Amatus attacked too early with only a small portion of his forces and was killed. Belisarius's elite Bucellari, his personal armored cavalry, shattered the Vandal vanguard. The Battle of Ad Decimum was a confused, sprawling affair, but it was decided by a single moment of weakness. Gelimer, advancing with the main Vandal army, came upon the battlefield to find the body of his beloved brother. Overcome with grief, he stopped the entire army to give his brother a proper burial. This inexplicable delay, this moment of personal sentiment in the midst of a decisive battle, cost him his kingdom. While Gelimer was mourning, Belisarius seized the opportunity to regroup his scattered forces. He then advanced on the disorganized and leaderless Vandal army and swept them from the field. Gelimer fled into the desert. The road to Carthage was wide open. The next day, Belisarius marched into the Vandal capital without a fight, the cheering Roman African population welcoming him as a liberator. The kingdom that had taken a century to build had begun to collapse in a single afternoon. Gelimer, however, was not finished. He regrouped his forces, including the army returning from Sardinia, and marched back towards Carthage. The final decisive battle took place at Tricamarum, about 20 miles from the city. Once again, the Vandals had superior numbers, but they had lost their nerve. Their army was a clumsy, undisciplined force compared to the professional Byzantine legions. The battle was short and brutal. Belisarius's heavy cavalry, the cataphracts, smashed the Vandal lines. As soon as the fighting turned against him, Gelimer once again panicked and fled the battlefield. Seeing their king desert them, the rest of the Vandal army broke and ran. The rout was total. The Vandal military machine, once the most feared in the world, had ceased to exist. Gelimer fled to the mountains, where he was besieged for several months before finally surrendering. The speed of the conquest was breathtaking. In less than a year, Belisarius had utterly destroyed the Vandal kingdom. He had succeeded where so many others had failed. It was a testament to his military genius, but it was also a damning indictment of the internal rot that had destroyed the Vandals from within. They had lost the very qualities that had once made them great: their discipline, their unity, and their unshakable will to win. They had become a hollow shell, a gilded facade that shattered at the first firm push. The Byzantine blitzkrieg was over. Justinian's gamble had paid off spectacularly. Africa was restored to the Roman Empire. The pirate kings were dethroned. The next and final chapter in the Vandal story would not be about power or glory, but about oblivion. It would be the story of how an entire people can vanish from the pages of history, leaving behind nothing but a name. The end of the Vandal story is as swift and brutal as its beginning. In 534, the captured King Gelimer was transported to Constantinople to be paraded in the triumph of Belisarius. It was a spectacle designed to showcase the restored might of the Roman Empire. The last king of the Vandals, dressed in purple robes, was forced to walk in chains through the streets of the city, followed by the towering Vandal warriors who had been taken captive and the vast treasures that Belisarius had recovered from Carthage, including, legend says, the sacred menorah from the Temple of Jerusalem that the Vandals had looted from Rome. As Gelimer was brought before Emperor Justinian in the Hippodrome, he was forced to prostrate himself. He is said to have looked up at the emperor and the glittering spectacle around him and muttered a line from the book of Ecclesiastes: "Vanity of vanities, all is vanity." It was a fitting epitaph for his fallen kingdom. Justinian, in a moment of clemency, spared Gelimer's life, and granted him a comfortable estate in Galatia, where the last Vandal king lived out the rest of his days in quiet obscurity. For the Vandal people, there would be no such comfortable retirement. The Byzantines began a systematic policy of erasure. The Vandal identity was to be extinguished. The surviving Vandal warriors were not allowed to remain in Africa. They were formed into 5 special cavalry regiments, the Vandali Justiniani, and shipped off to the Persian frontier to fight the empire's wars in the desolate east. They would never see their homes or families again. Their wives and daughters were married off to Byzantine soldiers, their lands were confiscated and redistributed, the Arian church was outlawed, and its clergy was exiled. Any public expression of Vandal culture or identity was suppressed. The goal was not merely to conquer the Vandals, but to unmake them, to dissolve them into the anonymous mass of the empire's subjects. The policy was brutally effective. Within a generation or two, the Vandal name simply disappeared from Africa. There were a few scattered rebellions, but they were quickly and ruthlessly crushed. There was no Vandal language, no Vandal literature, no Vandal art left to carry on their memory. They had always been a minority ruling over a much larger population, and once their military power was broken, they were quickly absorbed and forgotten. Where did an entire people go? They vanished into the bloodlines of their conquerors and their former subjects. They became a ghost, a whisper in the historical record. The people who had crossed a continent, sacked Rome, and ruled the sea were wiped from the face of the earth so completely that it is as if they had never been. It is one of history's most successful and terrifying acts of cultural annihilation. Their legacy is a strange and ironic one. They left no great buildings, no enduring laws, no lasting cultural achievements. All they left behind was a word: vandalism, a word that has come to mean senseless, ignorant destruction. But was their destruction truly senseless? They were a people born from the violence of a collapsing world, a product of imperial overreach and mass migration. They plundered the plundered, building their kingdom on the spoils of an empire that had itself been built on conquest. They were brutal, but they lived in a brutal age. They were destroyers, but they were also survivors, builders of a formidable, if short-lived, kingdom. Their story is a chilling reminder of how fragile civilization can be and how quickly a people, no matter how powerful, can be erased from memory. They are a footnote in the grand epic of Rome, a cautionary tale of a flame that burned with incredible ferocity before being extinguished forever, leaving only darkness and a lingering smell of smoke. The Vandals are gone, erased by the very empire they sought to dismantle. They left us a word for destruction, a stigma they carry through eternity. They built their world on the ruins of another, a cycle as old as humanity itself. But is the act of a barbarian horde sacking a city fundamentally different from a civilized empire conquering a continent? Who truly gets to write the definition of destruction? The one holding the sword, or the one who survives to write the history? The final judgment is yours.